Hi, today we're adding borders to our Blue Star project. It's going to be easy and it's got a little something special, so join us. And welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Hi, we're back today to add the borders to our Blue Star project. We've got all 5 rows of blocks put together. It's in a interesting checkerboard fashion with the alternating blocks, the busy block, which is called Sister's Choice. And I did have somebody ask me about this. I do not have a pattern for Sister's Choice. That's this block. You can Google it. If you Google Sister's Choice quilting block or quilting pattern, you will have lots of things come up that will show you this. I think it goes by a couple of other names as well. But this is just a standard old-fashioned quilt block. So I think you'll be able to find it by Googling it. My inspiration for this quilt came from a quilting magazine, and if you go back to the video on the introduction to this particular project, you will see all of the information about where I saw the quilt, what publication it was in, the name of the person who created that inspiration quilt, and their plain block, so to speak. This is what I'm calling this block. This block I came up with. It's a substitution for the block that they use in their quilt top quilt that was in this magazine. This is my change to this, because this is a traditional block, and then this was the block that I added. I don't know if this block has another name or if somebody else created it ahead of time, but it is something very plain and very basic that I just added to this to make it my own, my adaptation. So if you go out and Google Sister's Choice block, you should find something. Otherwise, it's very simple. It's just squares and then one square that's half a triangle and half a plain fabric. So I think if you looked out there how those blocks like that are done, you probably could come up with it on your own. Nevertheless, let's talk about why we're here today. We're going to be adding the border to this quilt top. And we're going to finish up the top today, and then we'll move on to what's next with this project. I want to add a plain white border around the outside of this quilt top, and you see it here. So you can see where we've got the Sister's Choice block down here, but now we've got this border at the top. And I'm making this border the same size that we cut our strips at. So our strips were cut at 3 inches with a 1/4 inch seam on both sides, so that will make the finished border 2.5 inches. Now you may want to make yours bigger, or once we add this border, you may want to add another border outside of that. And I'll tell you, I'll give you just a caveat, I might decide to do that too, because I've got plenty of blue fabric left, so we may see where that goes. But right now our task is to add that border. And in the corners, I'm going to add 1 square of the blue. So we kind of have a little finishing touch there on the corners to step it up just a notch. So how do we do that? Well, the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to take my white strip, and at the very first piece, I added a blue block. So I sewed the blue block onto the white strip and then sewed this whole border on, starting where the white strip started. Not at the blue, but at the white. And then we'll come back later and we'll finish that up at the very end. And then when I got to the next corner, I did the same thing, only I started with the blue block added onto this strip and sewed it on end to end so that the corner seams here join together. So now I'm going to do the next corner with you. And what we have right now is we have this one border that I put on and then a side with no borders. So we're going to trim this down and then we're going to prepare our strip for the next edge. So we're going to lay it out flat because we want to keep everything nice and consistent. And we're going to use a little square here. And we're going to line up the edge of the fabric on both sides. And I see we got a square, which is our first place to start. And then we're going to trim it just on the edge. And now that border, can't figure out how to turn it around, is trimmed even with the quilt edge. Okay, so let's put that there a minute. The first thing we're going to need is we're going to need a blue square. And then we're going to need a fabric strip. And I'm going to take, this is width of fabric, so it's got a selvage edge at each end. So I'm going to cut the selvage off here. My blade is really loose. Let's tighten that up a little bit. I'm going to do it again because it didn't cut on part of it. Oops. Okay, so now we've got the cutoff edge. This is a 3-inch strip. This is a 3-inch block. We're going to line these up so that that blue block fits right over that white strip. And we're going to add it with a 1/4-inch seam. Same settings as before. There you go. Simple, simple. We're going to do a little finger press here just to kind of get that going in the right direction. I'm going to put a pin in both sides just while we're working to kind of encourage it, to train it to sit to that side. Now, the width of fabric is not going to be long enough for the quilt, so we're going to need to add another strip. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the other end, cut that selvage off, and we're going to need to add another strip of fabric. And I've got a couple to choose from here. And I'm going to start with the longest one. You could use another full strip of with the fabric, but I'm going to try to do this with this one because I think it will work. I'm just stitching right sides together with that 1/4-inch seam. And again, my machine is set on 2.6. Now those are together. Let's do a little rough placement and see if this is going to fit. And we're going to be just a little bit short. Okay, sorry about that. I miscalculated in the number of strips that I was going to need and how much extra fabric beyond those with the fabric strips. So I ended up cutting 2 instead of 1 because I'm still not going to have enough for the 4th strip unless I get a little more fabric, because I don't want an inordinate amount of seams in that border. So I've cut 2 more strips. I cut the selvage edges off, and then we're going to sew this together just the way we did before. So we're going to stick those in there real quick. Okay, there we go. Oh, while I'm thinking about it, the last time we sewed on the machine, I had a lot of problems with bird nest and skipping stitches and just all kind of things. And I thought I had solved the problem by getting a little piece of thread out from the bobbin area. And then I rethreaded the whole thing and trimmed off the thread, and I thought it was done. But when I was sewing on the last 2 strips of the quilt top, I had it happen again. So I went through the whole process again of looking underneath the bobbin, of looking in the thread path, to rethreading the machine. I eliminated everything I possibly can, and then I decided I'm going to change the needle. Well, usually they advise you to change your needle when you start a new project, and I did that for this, but I think there was so much machine stitching in this project that it had got to the point that that needle must have had a little burr on it, and that was what was causing our problems. It was having difficulty getting through stacks of fabric where the seams had nested together. So far that seems to be working. So if you're ever having a problem that you just can't seem to solve, change your needle. We've got one strip here. This is 2 widths of fabric plus the little block on the end. And what we're going to do now is we're going to add this to our quilt top. Let's figure out where that is. So there we are. We're going to start right here from where we have a little border over here on this side and then the block. So that's where our blue strip is going, our blue square is going to go. And we're going to line up that seam right on the end. And it should end up matching with the end of the fabric. And that's great. And then I'm just going to roughly pin this here. About every couple of blocks. I don't want you to have to sit through all the pinning. And we're just going to kind of follow the way the seams in the blocks match up and how their seam allowances are pressed. We're trying not to stretch the pieced top or really the strip either. Now here's a section where the seam on our border has shown up. Ideally, I would like that seam to match up with the seam in the quilt top. That would have been perfection, but it didn't. This is another situation where if I had something that was going to see a lot of scrutiny, if it was going to a show, you gotta know your audience, I think is what I'm trying to say. And if you're doing it for your own pleasure, then you make that choice of what you want to do. Do you want to take it out and replace that seam? It might mean having to cut yet another strip of fabric. It may not. And it may be what you would be most comfortable in doing. Again, it may not. So you will need to make that choice. I think I'm just going to let mine be. There are some things that are very obvious, and then there's some things that, let's be honest, are a little bit over the top sometimes. So you make that choice. Okay, so I've got this pinned all the way down. We've started on the end where we already had a border, and we added the pin piece here all the way down to the end, and at the end the border is longer than the quilt top. And we're going to sew this so that the border piece is on the bottom and the quilt top is on the top. That will allow us to manage the seams as we go along, and we're not having to have a mystery when we take it off the machine. So let's start on this now. Now I am putting a little back stitch right at the starting point, because when you're dealing with this much fabric and this many seams, it does seem more handling at this point. And we're going to be sewing right up at that area in just a minute. So. My machine has a mechanism where you can set the maximum speed that it will go, and I just loaded a bobbin, and I usually have that go faster, and so I turned it down. I think I turned it down too much because it was just poking along. So now we've got it at a little better speed. Okay, and we're at the end, and I'm going to back it up just a stitch or two. Okay, so now we've got that next border on, and I'll show you here in the corner. It's not pressed, of course, but here's where we've put that blue square into the corner of that border. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? It's a nice little accent without having to go to a lot of trouble. Now the tricky part on this is that last square. So I'm going to go through and put the last strip of border on this, and when I get to the point at the end of connecting that little piece where the blue square is sticking up loose to the border, I'll be back with you and show you that. We have that fourth border on. The only thing we need to do is just hook it up to this last blue square. And what I did was, that was the piece that was on there before. Let me pull this a little bit so you can see it. And then when I sewed this last piece on, what I did was I folded this seam for this blue, and I'm sewing from this side, so I can just fold it under so that that little corner square is completely out of the way, and fold the side of the white strip out like it was flat. And I could sew that new border. When I got to the end of the white border, the last white border strip, and I came to this little square, what I did was I folded it back and folded it completely out of the way, so I could take that side of that very first strip that we sewed, so that I could take the corner of the quilt, let me get this right, and fold it out in its natural place. And then I could sew this last border all the way up and off the edge without incorporating this border. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim that fourth border. And we're going to carefully flatten it out. And we're going to pull this border down so that the very first border we put down is folded over just like we sewed it. And the last border is on in its already sewn position. And we want to make sure we get those seams so that they're laying the same way to where we're going to clip it. Now, the seam where you've sewn that blue square onto the white border should lay right on top of the seam for the last border you sewed on. And then we should be able to take a square, lay it on top of this so that it is lined up with the edges, and we should be able to cut it. I can't see up there quite as much as I'd like, but I think it's in the right place. All right. So now it's trimmed, and all we have to do is just exactly the way it is now, sew a seam just across this blue. And before I move it, I'm going to put a pin here out of the way, but I think I'm going to put a couple. We're lining up that seam on top of that other seam, and then we're going to put one right here in the middle. And we're just going to stick that on the machine and just do that little bit. And I'm going to back it up a little bit so we're over sewing where we already sewed. Little back stitch. And then we're onto the blue square, and we're going to sew right to the edge of the fabric, and we're going to give it a little back stitch. Okay, I want to make sure we got that right on the edge as well. Take our pins out. And that might be a little fiddly if you've never done that before, but it is quite easy. You just need to take your time and lay it out. And then let's pin this and I'll show it to you. There's your fourth quarter. Fourth quarter. Fourth corner. There we go. That's a better way to look at it. They're right there. So now we put a 3-inch white border all the way around with cornerstones on the corner that kind of repeat a bit of our pattern from our plain block down into our corner. So we have it. Now, the choice for me to make at this point is, do I want to put a blue border around it or not? I'm not sure. I think I'm going to need to think on that a little bit. But for all purposes, really, our top is finished. It needs to be pressed, and we certainly need to go through here and get the little threads out, both in the front and on the back. And I find that to be a tedious process, but something that has to be done, because you don't want to get finished with it and then see threads back behind your quilting. And even though we didn't use blue thread in this, so you're less likely to see a blue thread behind it, the fabric does fray and you will get blue threads behind it. So I would recommend that at the point that you're ready to sandwich this or send it off to be quilted, that's the last thing you do. That you pull your threads, you press it, and then you look again quickly for additional threads, and then bundle it up so it can go. The more it's handled at that point, the more likely you are to have some raveling and having some loose threads. But that's it. This has been fun, and I think it's something that if you've sewn along with us and you've created this beautiful quilt, it's something that you certainly could be proud of. It's an accomplishment, and it's going to be very striking. Again, any color you wanted to do this, you could do it. You could even do it scrappy. That's just a matter of taste, but the basics are going to remain the same of how it's done, how you put it together, little techniques that you use, all of that stuff. If you have any questions about this quilt, how it went together, please let me know. I'll be happy to address any questions that I can. and help you along your way. If you have any suggestions of ways that you think this might have been better, or ways that it might have gone together faster or more efficient, I'm looking forward to that question or that comment, because I'm always looking for ways for things to go easier. I love to quilt. I think I'd love to be in here 8 hours a day quilting. I'm not sure if I really would or not. I'd love to be in here 8 hours creating, that's for sure. Whether it's a quilt or it's 6 projects or 1 project, I don't know about that. But if you can make it easier and faster for me and everybody else, that'd be great. Welcome those comments and suggestions all the time. So be sure to join us, and we will see you next time at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Have a great week.